Okay, so now we're going to look at why had international peace collapsed by 1939. So the first thing we've got to look at is the long-term consequences of the peace treaties that had happened during 1919 to 1923. First of all, they'd made the League of Nations look less credible, as it upheld a treaty that was seen as unfair, unreasonable, and not worth it. And Britain basically abandoned France in the enforcing of the terms of the treaties, especially the Treaty of Versailles, as there was much British support for the facts against it due to it being too harsh. Hitler used discontent over the Treaty of Versailles to essentially rise to power. He pushed on terms of war guilt, disarmament, lack of self-determination, reparations, and the loss of colonies to push that nationalistic view of Germany forward and also use scapegoats. There was, along with the British view on it and the push of Hitler, there was general discontentment for all peace treaties, and with combination of the Great Depression, this did push for a more extremist view and more political violence and aggression from countries such as Japan with Manchuria, Italy with Abyssinia, and of course Germany, as we all know about. Now, also the disarmament and self-determination clauses caused a lot of issues to do with international peace and international conflict, because Germany was the only country to actually disarm, and of course Hitler pushed his disadvantage to help him rise to power by exposing the weaknesses in the League and the hypocrisy of the League, also allowing him to manipulate them slightly. Also, due to the large displacement of nationalities, there was a lot of more economically weak and politically weak states that drained the League's resources and meant that lots of stuff couldn't be done. So the long-term impacts of the peace treaties caused a lot of general discontent and a lot of general tension and weaknesses that could be easily exposed by people who wanted to essentially break the peace. Now, the failures of the League in the 1930s had a massive impact in the collapse of international peace by 1939, because it showed the League of Nations as losing the credibility, and the Manchuria and Abyssinia are often seen as the nail in the coffin for the League. It's what really did it in. It's killed its authority. And this incident, along with any other incidents, exposed the League's weaknesses and exposed France and Britain as unprepared for war, and how it showed how much they were kind of willing to avoid it. And the consequences of the failure of the League were that many people, and the crash, of course, and depression meant that many people were able to appease. And so Britain and France were very much appeasing Hitler because they couldn't feel they weren't ready. And so this is how appeasement came about, because they felt they weren't supported. And this made Hitler way more confident in what he was going to do. And so this led to the Second World War and other such things. It led to Hitler's rise to power, it led to Nazis and all that kind of stuff. So one question that's quite often quite popular in exams is how far was Hitler's foreign policy to blame for the outbreak of war in 1939? How was it actually Hitler that did it? And Hitler's foreign policies were for expansionism intent, clearly outlined in Mein Kampf, which was essentially his biography, his view, and his political manifesto. The fact that his Nazi party gained a large amount of support, and he often pushed on the edge of gambling. He took big chances that, if hadn't paid off, would have ruined him. For example, the rearmament, Rhineland, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And he was willing to fight for his interests, which was ultimately the reason he led for war. But he was also not afraid to rely on other methods. So he would often use the view of a logical gambler, as said by the British historian A.G.P. Taylor. He was a gambler. He pushed his chances at all other options before he went in. He played people. He played methods. He was a very, very sophisticated leader in how he did things. And he took a lot of choices which could have really not paid off if people had reacted the wrong way, but he managed to work his way through. And so his main policies was the idea of Anschluss with Austria, one Reich, one land of united Germans, of all German speakers, gain Lebensraum to the east, defeat all the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and also defeat communism. And his foreign policy was very much a gamble. As I said, he's not planned. He was encouraged by appeasement, and the failure of the League allowed him to work through it. And he was really, really looking for that great Germany vision that had originally been done by Kaiser. He was pushing for nationalism, and it was that nationalism against the Treaty of Versailles, which really helped him rise to power and really helped him to gain whatever he wanted in the way he wanted. So we're going to have a look at some of the events that showed Hitler's aggression, how different things happened, and what happened, and what he did to effectively rise to power fully. And it kind of then exposes other parts of the rise of international peace. So Hitler's plans were quite stealthy, and he was very often willing to take risks that were very, very, very large, but he still did them. And so, for example, there was the rearmament in 1935. So initially he secretly rearmed to reduce unemployment. He created flying clubs, which started up up his air force. And when there was hypocritism over his rearmament, when there was issues with rearmament and tension with it, he essentially disrupted the Geneva Conference by taking Germany out of the League of Nations and leaving. And this kind of pushed the Nazis further into support because Germany was full on for rearmament. And Britain thought that it was reasonable and not good enough to go to war for them to take Germany on, because most of the public thought the Treaty of Versailles was unfair. So they believed that they could just use Germany and let Hitler do what he wanted, because it wasn't going to affect them and it was a fair end. And also it acts as a good buffer against the idea of communism and communists. So for the start of it, Britain and France, mainly Britain, let Germany rearm. They looked at things and how Germany were rearming. They took up private agreements and they made sure that Germany were getting what they wanted. Now, one way in which you could see Hitler was very much playing the system was the Saar plebiscite in 1935, in which 90%, over 90%, resulted in Saar going to Germany, and this was a great morale booster. But it showed that Hitler was willing to work within the League, work within their confines to gain both support for the Nazis and gain what he wanted. Then in 1936 there was the rearmament of Rheinland, which was one of Hitler's biggest bets, in which he put over 30,000 troops into the Rhineland strip. And this, if it had gone wrong, would have been actually disastrous because it violated both the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact. And if he lost support, he would basically have been kicked out of power. But the British public perceived it as a reasonable way to defend Germany's own borders, as a reasonable thing to do to overturn what they saw as a bad Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler picked carefully how he'd do it, because he looked at the resources they had, and they didn't have much, so he picked a careful time and worked out exactly what it had to do, because obviously people were still distracted in Abyssinia, etc. But this did trigger something that then in the end worked for Hitler's. This was triggered by something that was very much in Hitler's favour, which is the USSR and France Mutual Support Treaty in 1935, which Hitler used an encirclement threat. And obviously with Britain's view on communism, it meant that they really stared back. They didn't mind because it was a justified response. It was Hitler protecting Germany from other potentially aggressive countries, including some people who were communist. Then another big step taken by Hitler was Anschluss in 1938, and this is when the Nazis basically infiltrated the Austrian Nazis and created riots in Austria, showing the Austrian support for union. And Hitler persuaded the Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg that Anschluss was the only way to solve the crisis, and he wasn't. Schuschnigg wasn't helped by Britain and France, and so he called a referendum basically from the push of Hitler. And there was an election, a general election, a referendum to choose if they should join with Germany. Now, in March 1938, Hitler's troops walked in without any military interference, and so the referendum results really didn't matter, though I believe it did go that way because Hitler was pushing pressure on the Nazi Party in there. And there wasn't much opposition, with Lord Halifax assuring Hitler there would be no issues because Britain felt it was right. They were German speakers under self-determination being unified. So Anschluss in 1988 was secure and significant. This was also quite significant because previously it had been blocked by Italy and Mussolini, so it's quite a big point of, wow, you actually did that. So that was a good point for Hitler, and that was one of probably his biggest victories as far as it goes in the lead up to the war. Then there was the Spanish Civil War, in which Hitler and Mussolini supported General Franco's right-wing extremist rebels against the communism. And this was shown as a kind of joke because the League of Nations was helpless. This was a practice for Hitler's new air force from the flying squads, and it also showed Hitler, both Germany cooperating with Italy, but also Hitler's view on communism and the anti-communism establishment. And then there was the Munich Pact in 1938, in which Czechoslovakia was essentially gained by Hitler. It aborted war, it gave time, people learned not to trust Hitler, and it kind of showed the appeasement as a failure. It kind of showed Hitler as taking a big risk, and it showed the Allies as losing their credibility. And so this showed Hitler as now not just being someone who wanted the land back as he had done with Sudetenland, but it showed him showed him as someone who was actually secretly going for it. And he claimed that the Czech government was mistreating Germans in Sudetenland and wanted to rescue them. And Britain saw these demands as unreasonable and pushed for this to stop them. But then there was the appeasement with Chamberlain coming back with a blank check that was for peace in our time. It was a joint declaration on the 29th of September 1938 that basically said that Germany could have the Sudetenland as long as they did nothing else and they wouldn't act aggressively. And it was meant to be the Great Pact, but it had no real legal outstanding points. And both the Czechs and the USSR were not consulted about the conceding Sudetenland to Germany, and so this was kind of a secret behind the back deal that was viewed badly. And then in 1939, on 15th of March, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia without any resistance in Britain and France, before finally he invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. This was, of course, the trigger for World War II. Now, the last point about the Munich Pact showed appeasement as a weakness because it was undermined, etc. But was the policy of appeasement justified? And you could say yes, because they needed to buy time. Britain and France needed to buy time. Chamberlain and Daladier needed to buy time for their country because they needed to refill their employment levels, they needed to repay their debts, they needed to strengthen their military and everything like that. And there was no League of Nations there to back them up because that had essentially failed. So appeasement was essentially the only feasible option. And as lots of the support was behind Hitler's demands due to them being just overturning the unfair Treaty of Versailles, it was seen as something that was okay as long as Hitler was not allowed to go away with further aggression, which of course he ended up doing. And also, of course, they did not really have the support of war within the Commonwealth. Britain saw the Commonwealth as their large amount of backup, so they didn't have support from lots of countries that would be able to back them up. And there was no US to back them up because they didn't really want to go to war. And they saw Hitler as a great buffer against communism. And for US, that was a big point. However, you could see appeasement as a major failure, and that's how I personally see it, because it encouraged Hitler's aggression, because it put a lot of trust in Hitler, it gave Hitler a lot of responsibility, it gave him a lot of power in his hands, and it showed the people as seeing him as quite a sane bloke, quite a normal bloke. And of course we now know who's an absolute nutter who wanted to do everything, but it kind of pushed Germany to grow strong. And for many people that seems good, but it pushed Germany to go strong to a point where it was at a greater level. And a key thing is that it alienated the USSR, which led to the Nazi-Soviet pacts. And that made war more likely, because Hitler was against communism, of course. We all know that was one of his main points, get Lebensraum to the east. And so the Stalin and the communists in the USSR really wanted to work with Britain and France to prevent Hitler from invading. They tried to appeal to them, and of course when they were left helpless without Britain and France, when Britain and France ignored them, the USSR were left with no other option but to push to get a treaty with Hitler to protect themselves from this policy of Lebensraum in the east. And so that's where they made the agreements over splitting up Poland for the Nazi-Soviet pact to not go at war with each other, become allies. And that meant that Britain and France were now facing both the large mass of communism USSR as well as, of course, Nazi Germany. And it also meant that Britain and France lost Czechoslovakia, which was seen as quite an important ally for them. It was quite on the edge of both communism and it was on the edge of Hitler. It was quite a nice buffer and it had a lot of industry and it was quite good. So it showed that appeasement was weak because it lost some important allies. It encouraged Hitler's aggression and it basically led to the formation of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which could have been potentially disastrous for Britain and France. So you've got to look at now, why did Britain and France cancel that policy of appeasement on September 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland? Why did they then declare war? And they saw both that Hitler's actions and policies were going beyond the League of Nations, beyond the Treaty of Versailles, and that was going to happen whatever. So they needed to then back themselves up. They saw the League of Nations as a failure, and so they could not see peace as something that was going to continue. Disarmament had failed, nothing was going to happen. The appeasement that they carried out, which was to allow them to prepare for war, essentially intensified Hitler's aggression. They started to see this, and when he invaded Poland, that was significant because that was nothing to do with the Treaty of Versailles, and so it saw him going outside of the Treaty of Versailles, and so it could see him as now going further aggression than just overturn the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, the Nazi-Soviet Pact basically saw them see he was aligning with communism, which was a great enemy, and they were starting to push against them. And of course, with the invasion of Poland, which is of course paved the way by the Nazi-Soviet Pact, that led for them to then be aggressive, and it saw as a violation of the Munich Pact, and so by invading Poland, it was essentially a Polish guarantee to go to war. So the agreements that Britain and France had with Poland, and of course the Munich Pact, meant that they essentially were forced to go to war by moral agreements. And of course USSR had time to rearm, and so USSR were a massive threat as well. You could also see that appeasement was the key reason due to its encouragement of Hitler's aggression. And Hitler's aggression and the Great Depression essentially saw that war was going to happen, even if something wasn't allowed to happen. And the Treaty of Versailles was the inspiration behind Hitler's revenge, but yet it was gone beyond. And so Britain and France declared war in Germany because they saw Hitler as being overly aggressive. He saw them siding with communism. It saw him going beyond the Treaty of Versailles, and due to the Great Depression, it saw him rise to sheer power that cannot be ignored. Now, this Nazi-Soviet Pact has been mentioned quite thoroughly throughout this as a key reason for the leading to war, and it's key both because it led to Poland being taken. It was because Hitler needed to have the opinions. But it was also key in showing that Hitler was willing to do pretty much anything to get what he wanted. Because in Mein Kampf, his political not biography, but his political plans, his political manifesto, he details how he wants Lebensraum in the East, which means take down communism. So the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed due to Stalin being alarmed by Hitler's aggression, and when they joined the League of Nations in 1934, they saw it as rather powerless. He saw France and Britain not resisting German rearmament or expansion in East Europe. He saw that they were failing to stand up to Hitler in the Rhineland of Czechoslovakia. He saw that they were doing lots of different things. Of course, we've heard about earlier was the France-USSR Soviet Pact that he signed in 1935, but that was still Stalin seeing as a security because he did not see France as a trustful place. And the attempt to form an alliance in Britain and France in 1939 was blocked due to Chamberlain not trusting Stalin. And so Stalin was stuck in that position where he did not trust Hitler, and he was in a situation where he didn't have anything else because he knew the British had a Polish guarantee, which means they would go to war. But it showed that Hitler was willing to do anything, and it showed that he was a threat, and so he decided that he had to do it. And so in the 24th of August 1939, Molotov and Ribbentrop, the two ambassadors for both the USSR and Germany, signed the agreement because Stalin could not rely on Britain and France for defence against Hitler due to appeasement. Hitler was essentially would allow Stalin to take control of certain areas, and he'd obviously have that backup that he could rely on, and it allowed him to take on Poland. Now, not Hitler signed it because it meant that he knew he could take on Poland without any threat from the USSR. He knew the USSR wasn't a threat, and it meant he had an ally during the war. And during the Nazi-Soviet Pact, it was agreed that Poland would be split. Now, this was a quite secret agreement, but it was well known at the time. And with the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, it both showed that Poland was about to fall, the war was essentially inevitable, and that appeasement had finally failed.